Hey everyone, Dr. Kuniak here with a video lecture. I'm sorry this is a little later than I wanted it to be, but uh, yeah, I'm sorry. Anyway, so what I really wanted to focus on here is, as you all know, I had heard that there might still be some confusion with the article proposal. So I put out my SurveyMonkey link and I got some feedback back from some folks, so that's good. The questions that I asked there were really the first one was just a yes, no. Did you watch my original article proposal video lecture from my announcement on 3/23, March 23rd? And the reason I did that is there were a few folks who asked me questions, and I came to realize that they had not watched that original video. And so I hope that my question didn't come off as snarky. I meant it to be kind of a prompt that if you haven't watched it, maybe check that out too. But I recognize that, and in this case, many of the folks who took this survey did watch the video, and some folks have some additional questions, and that's fine. I get it. Let me start off by saying, excuse me, let me start off by saying that research articles like this, and you are doing an article proposal, um, they use a format of writing that is not something that most folks typically do. And so the spirit of this assignment is really to get you to try it. Because if you never try writing in this format otherwise, you probably never will. And so then if you are tasked with doing something down in the future, you may shy away from doing it because it seems intimidating. So I want you to know that up front, that I have an understanding as your professor that you are not experts at writing research articles or article proposals. If we're being honest, I'm not an expert. I've done it, as many times as I've done it, but it's still something that I kind of have to feel my way through sometimes. It's very different from everything else you write, and that's okay. That's fine. I'm grading you knowing that this is probably for many of you your first attempt at something like this. So I don't want people to panic. The other thing is I saw some responses here that say, I think I'm overthinking this. That's possible. And I understand that that's the case. You want to do well. You're trying to think your way through something that's completely foreign. Um, I'll say don't overthink it. What I'm asking for, what is being asked of you is exactly what I want to see. So I'm going to go back through this. I'm going to check a couple of questions here as I go, and I'm going to share screen so that I can show you the outline again, just so I can kind of work my way through it. So hopefully you can see that. Moving this, oops. I want to try to move it. There we go. Hopefully, yeah, hopefully you can still see that. But this way I can kind of see some of the questions and go back and forth. So let's take a look here. One of the questions is, to just kind of go back over the format of what we're looking for here. So I want you to keep in mind that as you're writing a research article, you have to think about it in the stages with which this is being expected of you. So I said this in the previous video. I'm going to say it again. I am not expecting an abstract from anyone. I'm going to talk about an abstract here briefly, but you don't have to write that. If you wrote it and you already submitted it, fine. You wrote it and you want to include it, fine. But I'm not requiring it. Not something you're going to be graded on. But when you submit an article for consideration for a journal, they want an abstract, they want an introduction, they want a lit review, they would want a method section, and then conclusions, and then discussion. And so they may want other things too, but that's generally speaking what you're going to get. I submitted an article for consideration recently, and they wanted me to write a section that spoke to how this research study matched with the overall mission of the journal, for example. Different journals have different criteria, and that's fine. But similar to if you went to propose, I think many more people feel comfortable with proposing to say a conference that you wanted to do kind of a lecture for a a peer-reviewed conference, they would actually ask for some similar components. What is typical of a conference proposal is they want an abstract, they want 3 to 4, depending on their accreditation stuffs. They want 3 to 4 learning objectives. They want an introduction, which is written very similar to this introduction, much shorter, but similar. And then they want a longer description of how your study fits within the overall scope of the literature and what you hope to achieve, which would actually be similar to the literature review in this case. So they want all those things. And then what happens is, if you are selected, they take your abstract and they publish that in the guide to the conference. And they take your learning objectives and they submit those for accreditation. And then they also put those as as learning objectives in the conference guide for your presentation. And maybe on their web page they put the larger discussion, so they kind of cannibalize these pieces to use it. And so that's similar here. So what you're doing is, this way then in the conference, if I'm coming in and I'm looking to I'm deciding which conference session I want to sit in, I can read through all the abstracts and make an educated decision for which one I want to go to during this hourly block. Similarly, when you're trying to dig up a research article for a study that you're doing, or for a practice that you want to employ, or whatever the case may be, you're going to read the abstracts first. And if that looks good, then maybe you'll thumb through the introduction. And if the introduction sounds right, well, then you're going to dig into the whole rest of the article. So consider the introduction if I didn't have time, online there are lines that say TLDR, the acronym TLDR, which stands for too long didn't read. So if you want to skim through an online post of some kind and it says TLDR at the front, it'll give you like a 1 to 2 sentence explanation of what the whole rest of the online article is. The introduction is like that. It's, if I wanted to make a decision about whether or not I was going to spend the time reading your 10 to 20 page paper, I can read the introduction and get a good feel for what the mission of the paper is. If it fits, then maybe I continue reading. If it doesn't, then I discard your article and move on, and I've only wasted the amount of time it took to read your introduction section. So in this case, and hopefully you can see my mouse pointer, the introduction to the overall paper is an overarching discussion of the purpose and goals of your paper. It'll touch a little bit on literature, because you're going to need to use a little bit of that to explain why it's important to do this study. But really, if you did your introduction and did 3 good paragraphs, one that introduced presented to us the idea of whatever the problem is, one that then kind of explained what you would want to explore and what's important for the field of counseling, or why we would want to take a look at this stuff, and what might be a solution to the problem that you just described, and that was paragraph 2. Then paragraph 3 would just be the purpose of this study is, and then kind of an explanation of what you hope to get done in this paper. Because the reality is, it's one research study and you're not going to be able to hit absolutely every angle of the problem, but you're going to focus on 1 or 2 or something like that. And so that tells me what the purpose of the study is. An introduction, if you were writing this for a larger proposal that you were actually going to conduct or something like that, would be much more than 1 page and 3 paragraphs. It would probably be more like 8 pages, just like the whole paper should be in this case. But in this case, a 1-page introduction with a 3 or even 4 paragraphs explaining what I'm going to get out of the rest of my reading of this article is enough for the introduction. So that's the introduction. The literature review itself then has its own introduction, main body, and conclusions. Because now what we're doing is we're laying the groundwork for the rest of the paper and saying, here is what we know so far about this problem. Here's what everyone else has to say about, if I were doing a study about resiliency factors associated with substance abuse, Well, let's talk about our history of substance abuse and what we know about it. And let's talk about the variable resiliency and what we know about psychological resiliency. And let's talk about if there are any studies out there that we're aware of that kind of cross correlate between resiliency and substance abuse, and what are factors that might prevent someone from falling into the struggles of substance abuse. What are some factors that might help lead them out of substance abuse? How can we foster resiliency? Is resiliency more of a state or a trait? So really here, the introduction, or rather the literature review, the introduction of the literature review is essentially a restating of the earlier introduction with greater detail and a greater focus on the variables that you intend to look at. If you were doing a study about the benefits of music on mood, for example, I'd want to hear in this introduction a little bit about that problem statement again, rewritten, not copied and pasted, but a broader explanation of why I should care about this subject matter. I would want you to establish your rationale, what you believe is really going on here. Review the literature briefly in this case. This is going to be so if it was music and mood, a few statements, maybe a paragraph about music and what we know about the psychological impacts of music, a few sentences to a paragraph or so about what we know briefly about mood and how mood may change, or what can impact mood. And again, just kind of and what we know already about this stuff. Again, the idea is if I'm spending a lot of time digging through research articles to figure out what I need, the introduction caught me, and it's kind of sounds like it's going to make sense, but your literature review is 10 to 12 pages. The introduction of the literature review again sets up some detail about what we're reviewing. Let me give you an example about how this works, how this worked in my own studies. I would pick up a paper about video games and aggression, for example, because that's the part of the paper that my own paper that I was reading or writing. So I was reading a lot of articles about video games and aggression. I wanted to cover both ends of this for the literature review. I wanted to cover what people say that is kind of negative about video games and aggression, and I wanted to cover some of the articles out there that kind of debunk it too, because it's important to be balanced when we're reviewing the literature. So I wanted to have both. Well, if I found 10 articles that were about the negative impacts of video games on violent behavior or aggression, I got enough, in my opinion, on that. Now I need to take a look at the the debunking articles. And so in the literature, in the introduction, the overall introduction for the paper, it may talk about, the purpose of this study is to explore instances of the arguments associated with aggression and video games, and the correlation between these two variables and whatever the case may be. Well, it's telling me it's going to explore it, but I really don't know what they're getting into. So it's enough. It's definitely in the area that I want to look at. So I start reading the literature review, and I get through the introduction of the literature review, and I find out that no, this is another article that is exploring this, but they're really taking a focus on the negative impacts. I already have enough of those. So I'm not going to spend all of this time reading through the rest of the literature review to assess that. So the introduction here is kind of so now that I've got you listening to me, let me tell you a story. And the introduction to the literature review is that opening to your story. And there's some some other discussion here, but this introduction that sets out the rest of the literature review, if you think of like an outline of how this would look in an outlined paper, it's also going to kind of lay out. So like when I did my study and I looked at personality traits, coping strategies, resiliency, and then the connections between those three variables, in my introduction to my literature review, I talked about why this is important, why we should look at this, how this relates to counseling, what variables I want to look at, and then I explained them as, personality types and what we know about personality types for a couple of paragraphs. And oh, by the way, something that's related to personality is how we choose to do, how we choose to employ coping strategies. I'm sorry, I'm stumbling over my words. And so once we have a feel for how coping strategies are utilized and everything like that, oh, by the way, another thing that we find in the literature is, in fact, the connection between coping strategies and resiliency levels. And so then I talk about resiliency. That that combination, that sort of overview, is then the pattern that I follow for the rest of the literature review. I, in the next paragraph, or as soon as I finish my introduction, as I get into the main body, I start talking about my main thesis, the main thing I'm focusing on. And then I start talking about personality. And then I start talking about coping strategies. And then I start talking about resiliency. So the introduction to the literature review is giving your reader an overarching conceptualization of what they're going to find in this bulky literature review. Because if you were doing this as a true article, you would probably try to dig up as much literature as possible. So the literature review is bulky. It's a big part of your study, because you want to see what everybody else has said about this subject matter so far and present that to your reader before you talk about your study and what you intend to do with it. So that's the introduction to the literature review. So we have the introduction to the overall paper that's getting the person, getting their attention and seeing if this is indeed something they want to read. Now that they're in the literature review, sitting and listening to what you have to share, we set the stage for them with the introduction. It is a little bit, there are going to be similar components in this introduction to the first introduction, but this is the introduction to the story that you're going to share with me about the literature that you've dug up. And the main body is the bulk of your literature review. It has less features to it. This is going to organize your review into common themes. So again, you're talking about personality, you're talking about resiliency, you're talking about coping strategies, whatever order you want to do, music, mood, other interventions that help to impact, personality traits, whatever variables that you have identified that you're looking at in your study. There was an example up here of large literature on spouses in the military. So you would want to tell, so like for this one, literature on spouses in the military, your variables would be what happened, what do we know about spouses and the relationship between spousal partners generally. Then we want to talk about the military and what we know about life in the military. And then you're going to talk about the variable of how it is for spouses in the military. That's kind of how you want to break your literature review apart into the different components, and then the cross components, where the variables kind of overlap is its own subject matter too. But that's the main body. You're going to review then all of the literature organized around the variables that you have. And then your literature review has a conclusion, because when I, for example, talked about personality traits, coping strategies, and resiliency, I didn't just end my literature review with, and that's what we know about resiliency, and close. I then did a section about, so let me recapture everything that I've talked about for you, dear listener. This is again why this is all important. And you do kind of a concluding overview of the literature review. It's just a good writing format to introduce what you need to talk about it all, and then wrap it all up in a nice bow so that your reader doesn't have to guess, so that they don't have to say like, okay, he talked about personality traits, coping strategies, and resiliency. I think I got a good feel for how these things connect. Don't do that. Tell him what you want, tell your reader what you want them to get out of it. That's the conclusion. Make your logical argument based on everything that has come together. Then in the last section, the discussion conclusion of the overall paper, you are recapturing everything that you have learned so far. And again, you're wrapping this up in a nice concluding bow for your reader. As part of this discussion and conclusion portion for our paper, you're also going to talk about any new concepts that came up for you. So like, this is where you get to discuss with me, almost like you're talking to me, about everything you learned. So like, it would be, I knew about personality traits, but I didn't know that there were like, 7 or 8 different types of models to approach personality, and I gained some perspective on how we organize our thinking around personality and how many factors are associated with a motivation for a person. And really, that makes me think about how I could apply this to my counseling practice, because one of the big questions that I've had about my counseling practice is, how do I get clients to do something that they don't want to do? And it may have something to do with their personality traits. And so you're going to talk about all of that sort of stuff. What you learn new about this, new concepts, stuff that was familiar to you, but then the new stuff, and how this supports your study going forward. There should be a discussion on small discussion section that helps readers understand the information presented, discusses implications. So this is the why is it relevant? So based on what I've learned, this is why I believe that this is important for the field of counseling. A paragraph about how we might apply this. Like, if I was doing a discussion section in a full research article, I might actually propose different treatment methods here. That a person, we learned about personality types, coping strategies, and resiliency levels. Well, based on that, I know that problem-oriented coping, coping strategies are most effective for building higher resiliency. So my belief would be, individuals with these different personality types already have an affinity towards these specific types of coping strategies. So they don't need as much work on it. We just need to clue them into it. But these personality types don't have a strong affinity towards this particular coping strategy. So if we want to work with them to improve their resiliency levels, let me suggest these different treatment options to get them thinking differently about how they approach coping with things. That would be where I would talk about that sort of stuff. And then it would just be kind of any other concluding thoughts you have. Again, don't just end it with no string off. There's, with it trailing off. It should just be a conclusion to say, and again, kind of thank you for listening. I hope that what you got out of this is this. Sort of like in the introduction, you end with your purpose statement, so I know what I'm in for roughly. At the end of the discussion conclusion, you should just kind of conclude, and why is this important for you to, this is what you should have taken away. So that's all that. Let me take a quick look here. I think I answered, I'm going to stop sharing. I think I answered all of the questions as they came through. I'm going to kind of go through. So what's the difference between the discussion, the lit review, and the discussion of the whole paper? I hope I covered that well enough. I know I talked about it. No other questions at the moment. That's good. Just overthinking the assignment a little bit because research is new. I totally understand that. We reorder the outline from our draft article. Is that okay? You can reorder, say, the variables and stuff like that. Don't reorder the sections. It should go introduction, literature review, conclusion. But if you reorder like how you want to talk about the different variables, or even what variables you're covering or something like that, I'm not going to cross check against the draft article. But do keep introduction, literature review, and discussion conclusion in the same order. Hopefully that makes sense. Instruction is still somewhat confusing to me, but no specific questions. Okay, well, I think that I generally covered everything that was brought up as questions. So that's that. I recognize, I recognize how kind of unique this sort of writing is, and I just want you to take a good stab at it. Follow the outline that's there. It is a little repetitive, but it's building your logical argument for the reader is what you're trying to do. There's a scientific approach to talking about the thing that you want to accomplish, telling me why it's important, telling me what I should get out of this. Let's review what everyone else has had to say. This is the way I'm going to present that to you. Then I present it to you. This is what you should have gotten out of this. And then we conclude the paper with so I hope you got everything out of it. This is what I learned. This is my takeaway. This is how I would apply it. This is what I think maybe, we could do with this in the future. Again, the purpose of this study was to do this, and I hope you took that away from my writing. That's the flow of it. I'm not going to belabor it. If you have specific questions, I apologize for not thinking sooner about the timing of this with the holidays here. Um, that is my fault. We just kind of schedule this stuff out to meet needs based on where things are falling within the class. Um, but you have some additional time. So if you have any other questions that are specific to your paper, email me. Tell me what your variables are, ask me what your question is, and I'll try to do my best to, get you a response back that's helpful for organization. It seems like that's where most people are still struggling, but do keep in mind that I know that this is new. This is not typical writing for folks. So I'm going to keep that in mind. Write a good paper, a paper that flows, use good grammar, good writing format, graduate level writing stuff. And so long as it does indeed kind of model the outline that I've presented to you, that's what I'm looking for. And I can give you any specific feedback after I see them. Hopefully this is helpful. Again, reach out with any specific questions and I will do my best. I don't want folks to feel confused or overwhelmed or anything like that. This is just an attempt to teach you a new way to write and to approach the literature. Thank you all, and I will look forward to talking with you soon.